And in this video, I wanted to get back to bodybuilding history, another bodybuilding history video. So give this video a thumbs up if you want to see more and enjoy the bodybuilding history style of videos. So in this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about Lou Ferrigno. Lou Ferrigno is actually one of my favorite bodybuilders because if you go back into bodybuilding history, Lou Ferrigno had a pretty incredible bodybuilding career. If you go back, obviously there's the famous rivalry, 1975 Mr. Olympia, documented in Pumping Iron. Arnold versus Lou, the mental warfare between the two of them. And then eventually Lou Ferrigno taking third place and Arnold winning that 1975 Mr. Olympia. And then the long hiatus that Lou would take and then come back in 1992. Almost a 20-year hiatus from bodybuilding. And this is what I wanted to talk about specifically in this video, is the transition that we saw in Lou Ferrigno's physique from a standard classic physique, the 70s, the golden era of bodybuilding, the posing, the vacuum pose, the small waist. That's what Lou Ferrigno exemplified, the Lou Ferrigno that we saw back in 1975 in Pumping Iron. The classic version of Lou Ferrigno. The Mr. Universe winning version of Lou Ferrigno. He won the 1973 Mr. Universe. He also won the 1973 Mr. America, the 1974 Mr. International. He was Mr. Classic Physique of the 70s. He was fantastic. But Lou Ferrigno is one of those rare bodybuilding exceptions where he just took a hiatus for 2 decades between the 70s and the 90s. And came back and had to adjust to the 90s era of bodybuilding. Keep in mind, many people refer to the 90s as the beginning of the age of the mass monster. This is where bodybuilders started coming in bigger and bigger, and it was when bigger is better. Bigger was what was being rewarded in the 90s. There's really no denying it. So Lou Ferrigno had to come back bigger, which is tough to imagine. So if you look at the 1975 version of Lou Ferrigno, he retired after that third place placing behind Arnold Schwarzenegger and Serge Nubret because allegedly his dad was so disappointed in the outcome of that Olympia that he decided to disown Lou Ferrigno. So at the age of, I think it was 24, he retired from bodybuilding back in 1975. He would not see Lou Ferrigno compete again after that Olympia that was documented in the Pumping Iron documentary, until Lou would make his grand return to the Olympia stage in 1992, where we would see a completely different physique from Lou Ferrigno. So let's talk about the weight transformation of Lou Ferrigno. And Lou Ferrigno, I think, is one of the best to do this. The best examples of transitioning from classic to mass monster, because he had the height for it. He had the frame that could be filled out and still maintain a decent physique. So at 6'5" tall, Lou was extraordinarily tall for a bodybuilder. The average bodybuilder is for sure under 6 foot tall. But Lou standing 6'5", back in 1975, he was high 260s, maybe 270. Some say 275 by the time that 1975 Mr. Olympia rolled around, but I think that's a little bit high. I think the 60s, 260s, is a better estimate for what Lou was weighing back in the 70s. And a better representative of that 70s physique that we saw from Lou. And he was very classic back in the 70s. A very tight, good posing, small waist. Your typical 70s physique that was rewarded in the 70s. Now, fast forward to 1992. Things were different in 1992. Things were very different. at the 1992 Mr. Olympia. Size now mattered. It wasn't about posing and aesthetics and elegance on stage as much as it was dominating by size. 1992, Dorian Yates won the Olympia that year and ushered in the era of the mass monster. Dorian Yates setting the new bar. And at this Olympia, this was the year Lou Ferrigno made his first comeback to the Olympic stage. There were multiple comebacks that Lou Ferrigno made, but 1992 was the first. And at that 1992 Mr. Olympia, Lou Ferrigno took 12th place. And in 1992, Lou Ferrigno was now 40 years old. Now, I've heard a lot of different crazy reports about what Lou Ferrigno weighed. Generally, people say it was around 300 pounds. Now, I've heard a lot of different numbers. I've heard 315. I've heard 295. I've heard 300. 315 is the highest I heard. 300 was around the average. So let's say he was 300 pounds, which back then was just unheard of for a bodybuilder. Big Ramy right now is lucky to be 300 pounds on stage. And right now in the, we're balls deep in the era of the mass monster now. And Big Ramy is known as the biggest of all time. But granted, Lou Ferrigno's height was the reason for a lot of that weight. So let's just say a 300-pound Lou Ferrigno during his 90s comeback, in his 40s nonetheless. Now, Lou Ferrigno would not just compete in 1992. He would also come back in 1993 and improve upon that 12th place spot to place 10th. And then again in 1994 to compete in the Masters Mr. Olympia. Now he's aged to 42 in 1994, and he takes second at the Masters Mr. Olympia. And I believe the story goes that Lou was part of the reason they even introduced the Masters Olympia in the first place. So let's look at Lou Ferrigno in 1992. This version of Lou Ferrigno was a version of Lou that made even Dorian Yates look small. And yes, you have to take into account the height factor of Lou Ferrigno. But even with that, the size of Lou Ferrigno at the 1992 Mr. Olympia and throughout the 90s was a stark contrast to how he looked back in the 70s. And he's one of the few bodybuilders that was able to make this transition, and I think it's impressive. Because let's not forget, Lou Ferrigno is still considered a classic physique icon, but he's able to do both. He's able to also be this classic physique icon and be known for being this mass monster bodybuilder, one of the first to be 300 plus pounds, come in and make Dorian Yates, the beginning of the mass monster era, make Dorian Yates look small. I mean, this is incredible what he was able to do. And if you look at his physique, there's just a couple key differences. You see dramatically more upper body mass. His upper body is certainly thicker, and his legs are certainly bigger than they were in the 70s. The standard had definitely changed by the time the 70s came around, and you had to have legs. Back in the golden era, your legs had to be decent, but they didn't have to be as good as they had to be, as good as the standard was when the 70s or when the 90s came around. The 90s was a whole different animal entirely. So his legs were bigger, his upper body was bigger, his waist was thicker. It was certainly thicker, especially in 1992. And it was a different Lou Ferrigno, but he did it successfully. People were happy with what they saw. I don't think anyone really expected Lou to come back and actually win the Olympia. But for him to improve his placing and actually end up getting top 10 at the Olympia in 1993, I think is actually pretty impressive, because back in the 90s, those Olympia lineups were deep, man. I mean, you would have 20, some cases like 25 guys at these Olympias in the 90s. So a top 10 placing back then, and still now, is really good. But if you talk about cool bodybuilding history stories, for me, nothing quite does it like the story of Lou Ferrigno going from classic physique icon to mass monster, possibly 315 pounds on stage. 90s mass monster contender. It's a beautiful story. And I think it's one of the best bodybuilding stories there is, that Lou Ferrigno came in and made Dorian Yates look small. So let me know in the comment section below what you guys think of the transformation of Lou Ferrigno from golden era icon to mass monster contender in the 90s. Do you think he did it successfully? What do you guys think?